Yalamat everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening in this YCF initiated program titled The Mark of the Ineffable. Our today's event presenter is Afraaz Mulji. I'm sure most of you would know Afraaz, but please do allow me a few minutes to quickly introduce him and talk about his expertise. Born in Tanzania and now permanently based in Toronto, Canada, Afraaz considers himself a global citizen, an ambassador for pluralism and the cosmopolitan ethic. He is an improviser at heart, a musician whose music is a genre based exploration across numerous musical traditions. He is also an engaging and inspiring participant in workshops, recordings, panels, and traditions. Besides other lectures, he is a guest lecturer at the University of Dar es Salaam of undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. He's also a guest speaker at Conference of Organists in Canada and a guest speaker at Recording and Music Industry Conference in Canada. Afraaz has presented a number of lectures and workshops of his own design at Jubilee Arts Canada and other art and music festivals, including the art of improvisation and creative free thinking. He's a public intellectual, critical participant, multilingual, polymath, and a yogi. This evening, Afraaz will present an engaging session themed The Mark of the Ineffable, in which he will cover ever evolving work of pluralism through the practice of artistic and intellectual discourse, particularly in diverse Muslim traditions in historical and modern contexts. We formally welcome Afraaz and thank him for allocating time to share his education with the Jamaat. Without much ado, I will now hand over the floor to Afraaz. Over to you, Afraaz. Thank you very much once again, everybody.
I'm very pleased today uh, to engage in these poignant issues that I think are relevant to all of us, whether we consider ourselves Ismailis, Muslims, or identifying with other faith traditions. Although I know today everyone here is an Ismaili. What I'm trying to say is that the questions I'm going to ask are humanistic at their core and universal, and therefore I would like to start out by asking the question: what is Muslim art and what is Muslim intellectual? Well, I have a rather radical contention, and that is that, in fact, to identify something as being Muslim, to categorize it as such, is perhaps not the most effective way of categorizing it. And the reason I say this is because art is art, regardless of who makes it. But what we do know about Muslim traditions is that not only are Muslims diverse and pluralistic at inherently throughout our history, but that artists and scholars have been inspired by the idea of submission to the ineffable, submission to that which cannot be articulated, quantified, or explained, which is why the title of today's presentation is The Mark of the Ineffable. So there are many marks which identify something as being ineffable, whether it is the expression on somebody's face as they're singing a ghazal, or the way a dancer will close her eyes as she spins and she has one hand pointing towards the sky and one to the earth. So, as we all know, the idea of that which is beyond human comprehension is not only inherently part of the Muslim tradition, but it's part of our human interactions and discourses every day. When you have a conversation with somebody, and there's a moment of symmetry or a moment of alignment which you can't quite identify in words, but you know it's there. The reason you have the friends you do, the reason you might connect with somebody, you could argue that actually what connects us is the ineffable. Whether it's a chance meeting with somebody on a street that leads to a job, or a moment of beautiful art that happens on the sidewalk. Somebody's busking on their guitar, and you listen to that, and it takes you away from that mundane place that we tend to inhabit, because in order to survive, human beings have to deal with what's at hand, what's tangible, what's practical, and so art allows us to transcend. It allows us to go beyond the things that we have to deal with every day, like paying our taxes and going to work. So in Muslim and particularly in mystical traditions, the role of art and music and the garden and architecture is enshrined in this idea that through these expressions of you could say human interventions with our environment, we are able to create a space for where the ineffable can be articulated, where we can actually engage with that which allows us to transcend our current existence. I want to start by presenting a work of art that's made by my colleague Hussein Jan Muhammad, which is known as Sun on Water. And I think you will all recognize certain aspects of it from drawing from the Ismaili Ginan tradition. However, it also explores formally the Hindu tradition through Sanskrit and the Christian tradition of choral singing. That example, Sun on Water, I think is an example and a very poignant example of pluralism in action. And what we're seeing, what we're observing, is that not only are there intersections between the Hindu, the Christian, and the Muslim, but we're seeing that in the mystical traditions of esoteric gnosis or knowledge or wisdom, that everybody is trying to say the same thing. The message of transcendental, wisdom and of the ineffable is something that everybody in every tradition is trying to connect with, and so as artists and as thinkers and even as individuals, we have the capacity to see where these things intersect, to see where the meaning of a Ginan might coincide with a biblical quotation, which might coincide with a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. And so perhaps in the living tradition of pluralism, what we have seen in Muslim societies when they have flourished, when we have had Renaissance periods in our history, is when the imams have in fact engaged not just with Ismailis and with Muslims, but with people from diverse interpretations, whether they were Christians, Jews, secular, or otherwise. And in order to patronize people that had these ideas and these skill sets, the imams always engaged and embraced with all the people, the intelligentsia and the intellectual societies that actually carried this knowledge. And so we know that the Fatimid dynasty was a flourishing of knowledge, of the arts, a true renaissance. And we also know that in our history, for example, in the Alamut period, not only did we collect texts from diverse sources in astronomy, medicine, theology, and philosophy, but in fact, the scholars that were given a place at these centers of learning, at these seats of learning, were diverse and engaged with the difference in a way that didn't just tolerate it, but embraced it, to celebrate it. So my contention is that it's not enough to just tolerate difference. True pluralism is the embrace, the understanding, the engagement, the celebration of what inherently binds us together and makes us different as human beings. And that piece of music was an example of that symbiosis and that engagement, in action, in a very concrete but also abstract way. Now, the next example that I want to show is one of my own compositions from a concert that I did in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, and it's inspired by the Sufi idea of nothingness and of whirling. Now, it is rather abstract, and it is perhaps a bit difficult to see the relationship. But since I've outlined what it is, I hope that you're able to make the connection and see the connection as I was able to see it. Through this concert, I was able to communicate the provenance of multiple identities and no identity. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think pluralism is embracing the idea that things come from nowhere and everywhere. So, regardless of whether you identify yourself as being from Tanzania or Canada or Syria or Afghanistan, there is this idea that at the intersection of all these crossroads of, I would call it the contemporary Silk Route, because I consider myself a cultural spice trader. Quite ironically, most Ismailis are merchants. So I also sell things, but what I sell instead of products are ideas and experiences and values and metaphorically spices. So on the spice route, not only would that be a place where people of diverse traditions and philosophies met, but in fact, the music and the ideas and the cultures of diverse traditions would interact and create hybrids and synthesize and create what we could today amount to as fusion or the global village, perhaps. So, while on one hand, I'm very proud of the heritage that I embody, and I'm proud that I studied Indian classical music, I'm also proud of the fact that being a Muslim and being a Muslim artist, I can embody without it being cultural appropriation. For example, the traditions of maqam, which in Arabic means place. And perhaps when we talk about place, we have to understand that place is not just physical. Place can also refer to a station. So, for example, a lot of the Sufi poets and a lot of the Sufi mystics would refer to the stations one must arrive at or strive to achieve, and that the ultimate station was the station of no station. Everybody in the Muslim Ummah understands that life is something that is governed by rules, by the Sharia. But at the same time, within the Sufi tradition, it is understood that that is only the first door. That after you understand the Sharia, there is the Hakika or the Tariqa. And in order to understand Hakika, you must first understand the Tariqa, which is the path. And once you have understood the Tariqa and you have understood it on the Hakikat level, which is to say you understand the truth, it's then to see the truth or the eternal love in all beings, which is known as marifat. So in art, there are rules. In intellectual discourse, there are rules. However, I think the greatest artists, whether they were Leonardo da Vinci from Italy or Ibn Arabi, they understood that their work and their ideas had a kind of profundity which blurred the line between subject and object, profane and sacred, beloved and the one who loves. Regardless of the instrument, we're able to play ragas, we're able to play Mixolydian and Arabic scales on instruments that may not necessarily be considered part of the Muslim in the quote, and I say this with open quotations, in the Muslim repertoire. Now, that brings to question what is Muslim and what isn't Muslim. So I would argue a clarinet is a Western instrument and an instrument of the Western Symphony Orchestra. But I also know that it is and has been for a long time used in other traditions, whether it's jazz or a maqam ensemble, and that really the provenance of a tradition is not determinant on the instrument or the person that's playing it, but rather on whether they embrace the values of that tradition and that idea. So in that sense, if somebody understands the core value of Islam, which is submission to the divine or the ineffable, or some would say Allah, then you could argue that anybody that chooses to submit to the higher self or the highest self, you could argue that that is Muslim music. So some people wouldn't understand that concept, but for me, when I listen to a gong or a choir of Tibetan monks chanting or Tibetan singing bowls, that to me is as profound as listening to the azan or the Quran or the namaz. And I believe that the idea of art, the idea of music, is one that is not limited. The only limit to what can be considered art, what can be considered music, and what can be considered a text or even a discourse is your imagination. And by that standard, a piece of ceramic that we find in the ground is just as much a text as a Quranic verse or a piece of scripture from the Torah. And so therefore, I would argue that we understand and know just as much about Muslim civilizations through our artifacts, through our through the texts, and I mean texts in the broadest sense of the word, whether it's a piece of tile from a mosque with Iznik glazing, or the mashrabiyah that's currently installed at the Aga Khan Museum. A mashrabiyah was the privacy shield that was installed in the palace that protected the people from inside from being seen, but allowed people from inside to see what was going outside in the courtyard. So in Islam, there's the idea that there is the veil, that there is that which can be seen, and then there's that which we cannot see until we lift the veil. And through artistic expression and through our interaction with the ineffable, whether it's through prayer, which is considered the lowest level, whether it's through meditation, which is considered the second highest level, or sobe, which in the mystical and Sufi tradition is known as the mystical discourse, so the mystical speech that can happen, but it's not limited to speech. It could also be gestures. It could also be just being and sharing the silence with the person. A very poignant example of this particular way of interacting is the interaction between Shams Tabriz and Maulana Rumi. Now, who knows whether Shams was the sheikh and Rumi his student, or they were both equal, or whether they didn't exist at all. Now, I know these are ideas that are a little bit counterintuitive, but the divisions that we need in order to exist as humanity, the hierarchy that we all must exist in, when you're dealing with matters of the spiritual, of the ineffable, of the esoteric, and of art in its highest form, these divisions somehow disappear. We start to blur the lines. You stop seeing a person as being a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim. You just see him as a brother, as a member of the human race. And as a result, I believe that art and music are the way that we can fix many of the divisions that exist because of socioeconomic and political divides. So when I do a concert, yes, I'm an Ismaili, yes, I'm a Muslim, and yes, I'm Indian or Persian by heritage. But for me, that context is superseded, and perhaps that line, that boundary that some people might have is disappeared when they hear a piece of music. Because at that point, if you close your eyes and you listen to that work of art, it's either going to move you or it's not. And that it doesn't matter whether I'm Persian, whether I'm Indian, whether I'm Muslim, or whether I'm a bird singing, you see? And speaking of birds and the spiritual symbol of birds in Islam, it brings me to the conference of the birds. The idea that when you make that journey, that mystical journey towards oneness, towards fanafila, you're actually crossing valleys and mountains to arrive exactly where you began. And so perhaps in the same way, when we journey through art, when we journey through a discourse, we arrive not at a different place than we were at before, but with a better understanding of where we are, where we've been, and where we're going to go. So in that sense, through my presentation, I don't want to give you any answers. I don't claim to know the answers. I don't want to know the answers. But I would like to ask questions. Critical, open-ended, free-thinking questions that allow us to engage with who we are as people and to see our place in the tapestry that is the human condition, to see that we are threads in this tapestry, and that each of us actually has something to bring, and that all of us actually are artists. And this is an idea that Picasso most eloquently articulated by saying that all children are born artists. The problem is to keep them artists when they grow up, because we're educated out of being creative, out of taking risks. So if you take away one thing from my presentation today, it's that everybody is an artist, and that connecting with the creative side of our existence is perhaps the most profound way, in my opinion, it's the most profound way to connect with the ineffable. So I'm going to move on now and share an example from the Aga Khan Museum, and the Aga Khan Music Initiative's archive of an absolute master at work. And this music is virtuosic, but I would like for you to see past its virtuosity and look into its humanity, look into what it's trying to say, not who's playing or who's saying what, or what the instrument is. So if you want to close your eyes, I welcome that. If you want to observe, you're also welcome to do that. But regardless, I want you to really think about what this music is trying to say. it's known by many artists and many musicians that inspiration comes from the most unlikely places, and that ironically, when we end up looking for inspiration is when we're least likely to find it. In music and art, it's the same way. You wait with humility, and you wait for the muse to give you permission to say that Bismillah, and that, you know, you can imbibe, you can drink the wine of inspiration without her permission, but it'll just render you mute. That you have nothing to say until you're drinking from the teat of the muse. Well, tradition in that vein, it's understood that every artist needs a guide, a guru, a sheikh to initiate them, to guide them towards that light of enlightenment or of inspiration. Well, in Islam, it's understood that our sheikh is not necessarily always human, but that perhaps the idea of the sheikh, of the guide, can also be inspired by our physical environment. And the reason I bring this up is because I want to highlight the role of the garden in Islam. The garden is perhaps the most important place for us to contemplate and to build bridges, to realize that as mankind, we can steward nature. We can't force a seed to bloom. We can't force a seed to become a tree or grass, but we can cultivate the field. And in fact, that's where the root of culture, the word culture, comes from, is to cultivate. So in the agricultural sense of the word, that when you work the land, when you till the land, that is when, in fact, you are able to cultivate an understanding or an appreciation for that which is beautiful and that which is important. So architecture, and particularly the role of the landscape architect, I think is very profound, because it shows us that we can collaborate with nature, we can draw from it, we can be inspired by it, and that in fact nature and the universe are the highest sheikh, and perhaps the most profound source of inspiration to show us not just what we don't know, but how little we know. And when you look up into the heavens and you see the stars, it allows you to understand both your significance and your insignificance, the idea of permanent impermanence, if you will. So I'm going to share a video about gardens and the role of the garden that was compiled for the Ismaili website.
The garden has for many centuries served as a central element in Muslim culture. The Holy Quran itself portrays the garden as a central symbol of a spiritual ideal, a place where human creativity and divine majesty are fused, where the ingenuity of humanity and the beauty of nature are productively connected. Gardens are a place where the ephemeral meets the eternal, and where the eternal meets the hand of man.
Gardens are a central feature of the built environment in Muslim cultures. Some of the most famous historic monuments built by Muslims, such as the Taj Mahal in India and the Alhambra in southern Spain, have equally famous gardens. They are known as paradise gardens because they evoke the descriptions of paradise in the Quran, including rivers of water, gushing fountains, the cool, refreshing shade of lush green trees, and delicious hanging fruits. The most common form of Islamic garden is the chaharbagh, a formal four-part garden that typically features channels of water and a fountain or pool at the center. Such Persian-style gardens spread throughout the Muslim world, being adapted to different contexts from Andalusian Spain to Mughal India. Yet these formal gardens had their roots in agriculture and the need to cultivate a hot, dry landscape where water is the most precious resource.
If you look back historically in Islamic countries, the conveyance of water to fields, to orchards, to the bustan, to cultivate vegetables, food, was an essential piece of survival, and that those elements were then brought into the formal garden and envisioned as part of the Garden of Paradise.
So in this context, what we learn and what we start to appreciate is that necessity is the mother of invention, and that perhaps the idea of culture and intellectual discourse, or even of the public intellectual, is not so much a luxury or a frivolity, but a critical and immensely important resource for our practical and daily needs. So while music might not seem like something that is, necessary, I would like to challenge that contention by arguing that, in fact, the true measure of the wealth and the importance and the distinction of a culture is through its artistic and intellectual traditions. So yes, it makes sense to build a monument, a statue of yourself, and that's a way to commemorate something, or to have your name on a building. But I would argue that a beautiful piece of music, even if nobody remembers who composed it, the fact that it was composed, the fact that it was listened to, the fact that it was experienced, makes it worth creating. And perhaps in that vein, or in that method of thinking, we can start to realize that all of us are always thinking, about our surroundings, about our context. And so in that sense, we're all actively co-creating our reality. And what I think distinguishes a brilliant artist from a mediocre one is to realize that, in fact, the reason for creating art, while it is a justification, it doesn't need any further justification. It's something that can exist for its own sake, but that when you connect it with social justice, or with education, or enlightenment, that is when you can truly create profound art. Because if you are able to inspire or enlighten somebody through your artistic endeavor, through your vision, then perhaps that's the best reason to do it, right? Although there are different levels within art and within architecture and within gardening as well. There's everything from, an unkept wild garden of roses, all the way to an immaculately manicured lawn with a fountain in the middle. And I would argue both are beautiful, and that indeed beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So at the end of the day, no matter whose art is being appreciated or celebrated or disparaged, even if you don't like the art, you think that it's not worthy of being called art, the fact that it exists enriches all of our existences, and perhaps as a result of that, I would argue that whether it's a Japanese housewife painting in her house on a Sunday afternoon, or somebody who spends 10 years planning the building of a museum, in a very important city, that both are in a way equally important, right? Because, and I know that's a difficult concept to understand. I struggle with it myself, but I believe that the true measure of whether something is important or relevant is up to the context and up to the individual to determine. So in that sense, you may not resonate with a certain kind of music or a certain kind of art, but I would argue that being open to it, being open to having a discourse about it, being open to engaging with things that you may not necessarily be comfortable with, that's what allows for growth, both on a personal, intellectual, and spiritual level. It's the same reason that if you take your problem to 10 different doctors, they'll give you 10 different opinions. Because enshrined in this idea of knowledge and searching and asking questions is the fact that people come to different conclusions, people have different ideas, and that True pluralism is not to try to stifle these differences or to subjugate them, but in fact to engage with them in a way that's honest, that's kind, that's respectful, that's generous, you know. And I know that's different, that when you're dealing with somebody who you have perhaps nothing in common with, somebody who might have a view that's completely opposite to your own. Well, I believe that through an ineffable or through an artistic experience, we are able to bridge those divides. We are able to not only bridge them, but bridge them in a way that's meaningful and actually creates a tangible impact that people will remember and that people will be enriched with for the rest of their lives. So when Hazar Imam creates a park in Cairo, he doesn't create it for Ismailis, he creates it for humanity. And so, in that sense, I would argue that the mandate of the imamate is not just to serve Ismailis and Ismaili ideas and Ismaili functions, but to serve humanity. And so, as a result, I believe every single one of us has this common responsibility towards our fellow man, and that being Ismaili, that's where we get our values, that's where we get our value system, but that in fact those values are universal and transcendental, and you can bring the idea of pluralism to in any situation, whether it's doing business with somebody, or whether it's going on a date, for example, with somebody who is not an Ismaili. You can bring this idea of pluralism, of respect, of engaging with difference, of respecting what people bring inherently to the table. So I believe that because Islam is a universal idea, because it's an idea that's inspired mankind and humanity, whether directly or indirectly, through its achievements, that as artists, as intellectuals, perhaps our role is not just to create art and to create discourse, but to appreciate our role, our context within that wider picture, within that big picture, that in fact, when we do create a work of art, regardless of whether it's for myself or for 10 people or 100 people, 1,000,000 people or 1,000,000,000 people, the fact that I'm willing to take that risk, to bare my soul, to be vulnerable, to express that which makes me who I am, that is in fact what makes Islam such a beautiful religion. I want to discuss a seat of learning, the idea of the university. I think we're all familiar with the fact that the first university in the world was in Cairo, Al-Azhar University. It was the first formal seat of learning in the sense of the word university that we understand today. Although I would argue that the idea of the university as a seat of learning predates even Islam. And for example, when Aristotle was teaching Plato, his philosophy, I would argue that was in fact a university, a school of thought, a seat of learning. So the way that I personally approach learning and the way that I approach my interaction with art and with intellectual ideas is that in fact, not only do we have to contend with what's being done in academia, but we actually have to recognize that learning sometimes comes from the most humble and the most unexpected sources. A perfect example of this is perhaps the most profound mathematician to ever exist, Srinivas Ramanujan, who formally knew mathematics at the level of a fifth grader. But his work in pure mathematics, in abstraction, and in chaos theory, regarding quantum physics, regarding even gambling, for example, the formulae, the strategy that are used to make bets, or even to operate the stock market, they all came from his intuition. It was not formally taught to him. He did not have a formal basis in mathematical understanding. These were things that he understood through inductive and deductive reasoning. And so perhaps our methods of acquiring knowledge, we need to re-examine the idea that knowledge is always top down, that it must always come from formal learning and from formal sources or by reading a book. I would argue that listening to your intuition is perhaps the most profound way to engage with the ineffable, to engage with the esoteric. Because the greatest sheikhs, whether it was Ibn Arabi or Hafiz or Rumi or famously Mansur al-Khalaj, who said "An al-Haq," which translates to either "I am the truth" or "I am God," depending on how you want to interpret it. He was making a claim that could not be understood by many of his contemporaries and his enemies because it was viewed as an arrogant one. But perhaps a different way of looking at it, and the way that Sultan Muhammad Shah chose to look at it, was that he was claiming that in fact we are one, and we are capable of transcending our human limitations. And therefore, through artistic and intellectual discourse, we can engage with that ineffable reality, that oneness that exists. But I would argue that even if you're not formally trained as an artist, or you don't have an education as an artist, you can still be immensely successful and say things that are incredibly profound. Because as I think many people are familiar, Rumi was not just an incredible scholar of Islam, but he was a jurisprudent. He was a member of the school of legal thought that basically came from book learning. He was a very, very learned man. And apparently, in his first interaction with Shams at Tabriz, Shams came up to him and said, "What are you reading? What's in those books?" And Rumi says, "You wouldn't understand. You wouldn't understand." He was arrogant. He said, "You wouldn't understand." So Shams at Tabriz threw the books into the fountain. And when Rumi went to pick them up, to take them out of the fountain, because these were the most sacred possessions that he owned, his father's writings and his father's teachings, the books turned out completely dry, as though they hadn't been in the water. And then Rumi said, "How could you do this?" And Shams at Tabriz responded, "You wouldn't understand." So perhaps through that encounter, we can realize that there's more to life, there's more to reality than what we can understand on a formal or academic level. And for that reason, while I am an academic, I don't particularly identify with academia. I believe that knowledge and ideas and inspiration actually come from the most unlikely sources, whether that's an interaction with the person that sells me fruit, or whether that's an interaction with a beggar, on the street in Halifax when I sit down and play a game of chess with him. Perhaps there's more to be learned from that beggar than from the university professor that was giving me a lecture in a hall. Now, if we are to look at knowledge like that, the idea that it comes from everywhere, then we will remember the Farman of Hazar Imam, which is that even if you have to go to China or to the Middle East or to the most far-fetched corners of the earth, if there's wisdom and knowledge there to be gained, to be accrued, then go there, learn. Don't make distinctions. Don't judge where that knowledge is coming from or who it's coming from. Judge it based on its merit, right? So in that sense of the word, as an artist, what makes art art? That's a very interesting question, because, if I say something is art and you say something is not art, then perhaps we're at an impasse, and we have to ask ourselves, okay, who has more authority in this matter? But I would argue that even transcending the idea that perhaps somebody is more learned in a subject than you is the idea that you can use your intellect. You have the freedom to use your intellect to understand the perspective that person comes from and to engage with them, even if you don't necessarily at that moment in time have all the answers. So perhaps what I'm trying to articulate is that I love process. I'm not interested in products. I'm not interested in end results. I'm not interested, in statistics of whether something is successful. So if a painting sells for $1 billion, but I think it doesn't move me personally or spiritually, then I wouldn't buy it. Now, if a 5-year-old makes a painting of a boat that is, not particularly formally articulate in the conventional sense of the word, but it moves me to tears, then perhaps for me, that work of art is worth $1 billion. And so I guess the judgment of value and the judgment of of whether something has value, both on an inherent, intrinsic, formal, and personal level. These are questions that I want to ask, and that I want to encourage you to ask, not just about art, but about everything in your life. Whether it's a relationship with somebody, whether it's a business transaction, whether it's a decision you make to write a book, or to go on holiday to a certain place. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you invest in the process of being, the process of learning, the process of the acquisition of knowledge and ideas, then you're engaging with what is ineffable and what is intangible. So in that sense, I would like to claim that I'm not simply a collector of tangible and physical artifacts, but I'm a collector of ideas. And in that school, I would say that my personal artistic practice, lies in the Ineffable school of hyper avant-garde conceptual art. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to now play you an excerpt of a video of me engaging with the piano in a way that you perhaps may not have seen before or known was possible. What you saw there was me playing the tabla and the piano. Now, while the tabla is an instrument that is very traditional and has a 3,000-year-old history, dating from the most primitive form of the instrument, all the way to the instrument we know today, I was engaging with it in a way that some would consider abstract or avant-garde, because I was using the hammer. You didn't actually see this in the video, unfortunately, because they were focusing on my face when I did this. But I was using the metal tuning hammer on the skin of the tabla in order to create pitch bending and modulation. And of course, with the piano, what I was doing was I was playing it as a percussion instrument, which quite ironically it is, because a piano, while it's considered a melodic and harmonic instrument, is actually a series of hammers which are hitting a bunch of strings. So I was attacking the strings using mallets and sticks. So perhaps that's an abstract way or an avant-garde way of approaching the piano, but I would argue, quite ironically, it's very traditional. It's actually looking at the piano as a percussive series of sonic possibilities. So whether that's hitting the soundboard, the wooden soundboard of the piano, and allowing that to resonate through sympathetic resonance, or as I was doing, directly playing the strings and creating certain notes or series of notes that were either in tune or out of tune, depending on how I hit them. So what I'm trying to articulate, I suppose, and highlight through my examples is that my approach to art is financed by a wealth of knowledge in the classical or traditional ways of approaching music, but I'm taking that knowledge and those techniques which I acquired through formal study, and then forgetting everything that I know So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that while on one hand, there are standards of what is beautiful, um, we can examine or re-examine those perspectives or those ideas through our respective practices. Whether you're an artist formally or informally, whether you're a businessman or a politician, whether you're a housewife or a gardener, there's room for creativity. There's room for the ineffable and the abstract and the intangible. And I believe that it's a part and an integral part of our everyday lives. So I'd like to thank you all for listening, for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Faraz. Really, you led us through a very fascinating journey. So before, in regards to these ideas of ineffable, which of course means undescribable, and really,
Yes.
it's not easy to perhaps describe the undescribable. And the way you took us from that path of, starting with those Sufi ideas of Sharia, Tariqa, and then Hakika and Marifa, and then of course the projects that Imam has, the idea of nature, the idea of music. I just recall about this Aga Khan Music Initiative and also the Aga Khan Museum, and also the gardens that he has created. So it is so much spiritual. It is so much, it takes us to esoteric understanding, and that's exactly what perhaps was your message. That it is very broad, it is very wide. It doesn't have to be confined in a very limited sense. So I guess that's really appreciable. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed your ideas. Thank you very much, Afraz. Thank you once again on behalf of the Youth Coordinating Forum, comprising Itra for Tanzania, Youth and Sports and Arts and Culture portfolios of the Council. Finally, wholehearted appreciation, admiration to President Afraz. In the end, on behalf of the leadership of ITREB and the National Council, our gratitude to all of you. You all sacrifice your personal and domestic engagements to attend the program. Thank you very much. Have a very good evening, and Yali Mudad. Thank you once again.